So thanks, Elizabeth and Andy, for having me talk today. I got a whole bunch of notes here. So she asked me to talk. She said, I think you got a story to share. And I thought, well, I mean, maybe. I'm not sure. It's been my story. So, it's just kind of in my life. But I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit today about my life, kind of where I come from, some things that have come before me, kind of where I'm going to. I think the title of the talk today is more just around like self-discovery in that journey that we all kind of take within, or at least get invited to take within. So, I appreciate if you just kind of hang on with me. It may have some ups, downs. It may get a little bit boring. I can get kind of heady sometimes, kind of lost in my own thoughts, which is why I write a bunch of stuff down so that I stay on track. Else we'll get lost, or I'll get lost. So with that, maybe if you have something to write with or like a phone, I'm going to ask you guys to maybe jot some things down or some thoughts as we go along too. So just grab that handy. But before we get rolling, I want to just acknowledge that, 20 years ago tomorrow, we had, the 9/11 attacks. It's been 20 years. I can't believe that. I remember that happened. I'll talk about that a little bit today in my story. It's crazy. I helped train, to put people in the military that were like toddlers when that happened, and they were still fighting, and we are still fighting from events that happened that day. So I want to take maybe like 30 seconds, just have a moment of silence for the people that were lost that day and for the people that have been lost in the war since then. So let's just take 30 seconds. Okay. All right, so the first question I have for you, I want you guys to write down, is to think about like how much of your behavior do you think you're in control of? Like you as an individual, how much is conscious decision making and your behavior is driven by what is in your conscious thought? I just want you guys to think about that. What percentage? Is it 10%, 20%, 90%, 3%, whatever? Just think about it. How much of your behavior is controlled by you and you alone? Just have a little think about that, whatever pops into your head. And it could be some things, you do every day, you do every week, you do every year. I don't know, however you want to think about your behavior. So, went over my intro. So I just, I want to talk to you guys about my experience, my story. It's really just it's a story about like doors that kept opening. I don't know if you guys have anybody read Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey? Awesome book, even better audiobook. I mean, like super entertaining, like the best audiobook I've ever listened to. Not only is it Matthew McConaughey's voice, but like he impersonates like the characters and all that. But anyways, I said to say like a Green Lights it resonated with me. I think about doors opening and me just walking through them, but that's kind of what my life's been like. So to me, like every step has just kind of been the next step along the way. It's not really been that like transformative or like that amazing or like that explosive or anything like that. It just kind of happened. Like, so door opened. I said, oh, it's interesting. I'll walk through it. So I just kept going. But my hope today is that, someone's inspired and you kind of take this journey, inspired to take the journey, to take the quest and maybe, risk it all and like find another or a lost part of who you are. So that's kind of my hope for today as I share these things with you. So before I talk about my story, I think I got to start like a couple hundred years before I got here, because I think that's where a lot of things start. So many things were set into motion before I even got to the planet that, I think it's important to mention. So, just think about that. Like, I think of myself as more of an expression of history than an individual, more of an expression of my culture than I am, necessarily a person, especially when I'm, just came out of the womb. I mean, all the assumptions, the mindsets, the religious beliefs, all these rituals, attitudes, all these things were already in place in my community, in my family, in my country, things that I had no part in whatsoever. I was just born into them. They were the air that I breathed. They're kind of like a fish in the water that I swam in. So I want you guys to think about that too. What's the air that you might be breathing or that you have been breathing? What's the water that you've been swimming in? So, I'm going to start back like a few centuries. The original John Newnam. So he came over in like the mid 18th century, something like that. He was an indentured servant. Better? All right. He was an indentured servant. He came over, he moved to Maryland. His master lived in Maryland, and he worked off his indenture. After he worked off his indenture, he moved down to North Carolina with 5 sons. They moved to this place near Greensboro. If you guys are familiar with North Carolina, they lived out in Rockingham County. So they stayed there for several generations. In fact, I was born in the same county that my father was born in, that my grandfather was born in, and probably his father, and probably his father. But I couldn't find too many records about where exactly they were born. I was born in the same hospital as my dad. But eventually, my grandfather, Robert, he was born. And the story that I was told was that when he was about 9 years old, his mother said, I don't really want to have a kid anymore. So she walked him, whatever, down to the like a local orphanage and dropped him off and said, peace, I don't want to have a kid. So I don't know what happened to my grandfather through this period, but he grew up. He eventually met my grandmother, Helen, and she was living there at the time too. And Helen, the story that I was told about her was that she was actually the product of a rape, and it was a rape by a close family member that had Helen. It was all kind of covered up, and I always found that interesting, these stories about this small town in North Carolina where my family was from. One, everybody knew everybody. Everyone was kin, which I always thought was interesting. Is are they all really related? I don't really know, maybe. And they would switch their names, they would change names with each other and all kinds of stuff. It's my dad, sometimes he sits me down and tries to explain with a shoebox of photos, well, this was this one person, but then they married this person, but they switched their name to this, which was this other family, all this stuff. And I'm just I don't get it, Dad. And I say I'm going to need something more than a 2-dimensional graph to figure out this family tree. But anyways, the community, they kind of buried these individual right violation, right? Everyone beat their kids, everyone did this, did that, whatever. It was all kind of hush hush, and we didn't really talk about it. Wanted it better to keep the community together rather than kind of disrupt what was happening in that small town out in North Carolina. So, Robert and Helen, they met each other, they got married, and they had a difficult life. So they both kind of came from some extraordinary circumstances. And Robert went off to World War II for a little while, got back. They both worked shift work, but they never really saw each other. Were never at home. And this brings you to my dad. So my dad's name's John as well, which is coincidence. They didn't know about the other John that came over at the time. But he was born in 1955 to Robert and Helen. And he was the youngest of 4 children. So when he was born, he was really sick, and they thought he was going to die. And so kind of in retrospect, as I've kind of unpacked some things in my family, I think my grandmother distanced herself from my dad because for the pending loss. This child's going to die. I'm just not going to attach to it. And so, I don't think she really ever fully took him in because she was always expecting that loss, but he survived. My dad lived. And I say this, about my dad, and he may watch this one day, and he would agree. You can say a lot of things about my dad, but he's very stubborn, and he's very driven, and he was determined to live, and so he did. So, he grew up. When he was 5 years old, his older brother, Wayne, got into a car accident and died. He was 16 years old, and that kind of tore the family apart. My grandparents separated. My dad started working a full-time job when he was 12, and he moved out when he was 16. His first bed when he got out was on plywood, and he slept on cinder blocks, kind of in an old shed that he rented from somebody. So, he had a rough go at it, but he never gave up. He was he kicked down doors and he walked through them. So that was my dad's story, a little bit about him. And then he met my mom, Liz. They were in their 20s. And she kind of came from a typical Midwest family, I guess, whatever that means. That's what I wrote down. But her parents were 15 when they had her. So they were 15 years old. They had my mother. And I think in a lot of ways, my mom, what was asked of her was to kind of help raise her parents, because they were still growing up and they had this baby, and then they had more kids. They had 2 more kids and they needed help. So my mom kind of took care of my grandparents a lot. And I think she still does that a lot today too. And her siblings helps out a lot. And they'd probably smack me around if I said that. But so it was what was asked for at the time, and I think of my own self and what kind of expectations do I put into my children even today. But my mom and dad, they were walking through doors together. They were trying to build a better life. So, I'm painting kind of a hard picture here, but I don't think either one of my parents would have said that they had a bad childhood. They talk fondly about, memories they have of like playing in creeks, my dad trapping animals and hunting, like the pool time, barbecues, all that kind of stuff. They had a good life and they remember it in a good way. I even put in here that my dad, he had a 69 GTO when he was 19 that he bought from a guy who ran moonshine in Appalachia, which I think is awesome. Like, I want a 69 GTO. Does anybody know you know what that is, right? Okay, all right, yeah. Yeah, it was a 400 Ram Air 400. It had like a little tack in the hood. It was pretty sweet. So I don't think, well, he didn't tell me if it did or didn't, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did a little swap there. But so then getting to me. Let me get a drink of water. Moonshine is terrible. Like real moonshine, it's disgusting. Yeah. It can clean an engine though. So I'm told. So I'm the oldest. I'm the oldest of my family of origin, but I was the third child that was born. My mother lost her first one. It was a stillborn child. And my older brother, Brian Matthew, he died just a few hours after he was born. And my mother's labor with me was extremely painful. The doctors had to make several, I would just say, almost gory medical interventions to get me here. But I got out. I made it, and I passed through that first door. And I kind of I think about that as like that was a spiritual like death and a physical awakening in that moment. And I think about that was the first transition and door that I went through. And I just think about I put in here like tick tock, the lights were on, like the clock was ticking. I think about the transition from like being a kind of a water, animal to breathing air, and like how scary that must have been, and being inside of a womb, being comforted and warm and liquid, and then suddenly the contractions happen, and you're being forced, into a tight space, and then bam, bright lights, my lungs are transitioning to air, all these things that I think are just, commonplace. And I've witnessed this. I delivered my second child with my wife. And it's just incredible. I think it's an incredible thing, that first transition that we all made, like we all made it, And I don't know, it's just incredible to me. So I got here and, I want to, with this part, with me being here now in the story, the behavioral patterns that get passed down generation to generation, they're real. A lot of things, attitudes, mindsets, they stay with generations. If you guys don't believe that, you can look at some of the latest research on epigenetics. So, they do studies with mice, like, maybe they have a mouse, they make them smell like a cherry scent, and then they shock them at the same time. So they develop like this fear, this like, they want to stay away from like the smell of like cherry or whatever, or a flavor. They actually show they can take them out of that situation. They can go 2 generations, and like that mouse's grandchildren will associate like fear with that smell or that taste. So like you can literally pass things down through like through your offspring, these mindsets, these fears, things like that. So not only is behavioral patterns that we all, I think, can pretty much identify with, but also from a genetic perspective, from a DNA perspective, you pass things down to your kids and they to their kids. So my parents loved me with all their hearts. I had a great childhood. In the Newnam family, I was the first in my bloodline to be brought home from the hospital to a house with indoor plumbing. So think about that for a second. Like my dad, up until the point he was 9 years old, had to go to an outhouse. Like they did not have indoor plumbing. So, I was doing pretty good. For like a generation of my family, like we were doing well. We had moved to Tennessee at this point when I was about 2.5. And so I was there. I found this friend, and I lived very close to us. I love this friend. He was awesome. He was kind of the yin to my yang. Said, we did everything together. We shared stories, food, sports, tree houses, and we were physically inseparable. And so I'm going to call his name George, just to kind of protect him a little bit. But we're going to learn a lot more about George. So George was totally different than me. but there was like this magnetism about him. And I don't know if you guys had childhood friends like that or have friends like that right now that just kind of seem to be like that complement to you. You know, they're not like you, you're different, but like you have a great friendship and relationship. You know, George, he was a drawer, he would color, he would create. He would always ask these big existential questions too as a little kid, you know, about religion, God, you know, right and wrong. He was super curious and he was always asking questions, you know, like, you know, why do things have the names they do and who named them? You know, why do ants, you know, how do ants know what to do? Why do people say they want something, but they do the opposite thing? You know, he was always asking these kinds of questions. George would talk to me about his parents. His parents weren't cool with these kind of questions. So, and I can relate to that too as a father as well. You know, sometimes I'm just like, no more questions. Like I just cannot handle it. Like, cause I said so. And I always said that I wouldn't say that, but I ended up saying that. But they didn't like the questions. They didn't like his playful spirit. And I think it's because, you know, maybe they didn't recognize that was an expression of his being. So he felt alone. He felt isolated. You know, their comments were judgmental. He had physical punishment for asking a lot of questions. You know, he'd really get it when he would question like authority from his parents or authority from God, because they were devout Christians and committed to that religion. So there wasn't much place in his house to ask for questions. You know, I would say to George sometimes, I'd be like, hey, you know, man, just stop asking questions. Like, you know what's going to happen. You know what they're going to do. So just stop doing it. Like, why do you even continue to ask these kind of questions? But he wouldn't. He would just continue. But I love George. I loved his thinking, and I loved being around him. So we continued to grow into high school. George and I were both active in sports. But George started to develop a weight problem. And in retrospect, I think George had like this emotional need inside of him. He was trying to fill this void or this hollowness that was an emotional hollowness, and he was trying to do it with food. And he'd never get full, right? He was trying to fill an emotional need with something physical. And so, you know, I think he would do that, and he'd feel guilty, and, you know, he'd feel bad for that and eat more. And I think you guys have heard this kind of story before, but it was just kind of a vicious cycle. And he was morbidly obese, you know, by the time he was in mid-adolescence. He was over 300 pounds by the time he was 14. You know, he'd struggle to make other friends, and he struggled to kind of just fit in and find his place. But I still love George. You know, meanwhile, I was getting good grades. I was working a part-time job, and I was planning to go to college too. So I went off to college to study electrical engineering. And George, you know, he stayed back home. And I remember, this is where the 9/11 piece comes in. So I remember 9/11, I was in chemistry lab. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. The professor walked in. He said, hey, I think you guys can go home and learn something more right now by watching TV than you can in chemistry lab. He said, terrorists just attacked the World Trade Center. And I was like, what is the World Trade Center and where is it? Because I was in Tennessee and I didn't know what it was. And they said, you know, it's in New York. And I was like, you know, I had no idea what was going on, right? So I went back, and as I walked through the dorm room, I just remember every door being open and the television being on. It just had, you know, the first tower had been hit and the smoke was pouring out. For me, you know, I felt a sense of, I'd always wanted to join the Marine Corps when I was a little kid. I used to run around and hide. I wanted to be a sniper, actually. So I was really good at hiding. I was really good at shooting. And that's what I wanted to do. But that kind of passed a little bit. I was in school, but it reignited some of those feelings. And then the Navy came knocking a little bit later and said, hey, we're recruiting people, we're recruiting engineers, you can use your degree, serve your country. And so that's when I made the commitment at that time that I wanted to go into the Navy. So made that commitment, ended up graduating and becoming an officer. But that was a door. That was another door that just opened. I felt compelled and I walked through it. So as I continued to go through college, you know, George and I kind of had a falling out. I was having a great time at school. You know, I had a girlfriend, I had new friends, I was going to parties, you know, working out, doing kind of the typical like college stuff. You know, George was back home. He was very expressive. I always admired that about him. He could show his emotions, but you know, his feelings were like constantly hurt. He just felt like he was constantly getting trampled on. He was sensitive, you know, being gullible and just, I felt like he let people kind of walk all over him. And he would continue to let them back into his life. But we were both opening and closing doors. George eventually got married, we grew apart. I married my college girlfriend and then got commissioned in the Navy. So, my parents were proud to have someone that was serving their nation. So, and that's I think, very kind of typical of some of the communities that I came in, or in the Southeast. I say here that I was submersed in a culture that valued knowledge and the right answer, which is kind of funny because I was a submariner. I think it's funny. So, I was usually given the most demanding jobs. I led teams on many classified missions. Outperformed my peers and some of my superiors, but I did it with grace. And I would think about George from time to time, but I'd quickly kind of push those thoughts outside of my head. One day I got an email from George while I was underway. He was struggling. His marriage was deteriorating. His parents were constantly judging him kind of overtly and covertly for the decisions he made. He made poor friends and poor decisions, and he was reaching out to me. He was asking for help. I thought that tough love would be like the right way to go with George. So I told him that I was disappointed too. I told him that he was failing, and especially if he couldn't hold on to his marriage, he was just going to continue to be a failure. I told him that he needed discipline, hard work, and structure in his life if he wanted to go anywhere. And I told him really to stop being a baby, stop being so emotional. Told him to stop being so sensitive, and I told him that I was a little bit disgusted with his behavior. Told him that he needed to stop drinking so much and take care of his body and start going to church. And I said God must be punishing him. And in some degree, I think I resented him. So I hit that send button, and I was starting to walk through another door. So there I was in a hotel room when I got the news. So George was dead. And we're still not exactly sure how he died, but I suspect it was probably of a broken heart. I think the void inside of George, I think it finally swallowed him up, just that hollowness that I talked about earlier. For me, I thought George is my other side. I can't believe he's gone. And I had a profound sense of loss, even though I wasn't connected. I felt distance, but I felt like I'd lost something very close to me. I thought I got to press on. I thought all these emotions are dragging me down. I just got to push it out, and I got to keep on going. Thought I have work to do, and I've got men that I have to lead. So I went on and lived, some more into that self that I created. I don't know if you guys are tracking with me, but I had created a persona. I was living into something. I was leaning further into the tails of balance. So without George, I became so desensitized, I didn't even see the dark side of who I was sneaking up on me. My marriage was out of control, and I was out of control. I was out doing all the drinking and the late nights, lapses in judgment, and I was falling apart, and I knew it. One day I was on the bridge of the submarine, which is up at the top, and we're exposed to the elements when we're out there. And I was driving on the North Atlantic in a storm, and it was about 35 degrees seawater, and it was splashing up on me, hitting me. I mean, there was big waves. I was trying to get to a dive point. All the other officers were down below. A lot of them were asleep, and I didn't want to rack anybody else out, get them out of bed, that's what that means, to come relieve me. I couldn't feel my arms and my legs for probably about 2 hours, but I kept pushing through. I really, when I was having difficulty standing, that's when I knew something was really wrong. So I was able to get down the ladder, got down, they pulled all the protective gear off of me. And my arms, hands, and feet were very dark purple. They were almost black. They warmed me up. The doc, you got a corpsman underway. He didn't really know what to do, so they put me in a warm shower. That was probably one of the most painful experiences of my life, just with the blood kind of coming back into my limbs. I was, trying to be, I think, I don't think so much a hero, but I just didn't want the ridicule, and I did want to protect some of the sleep of my other friends, my peers. But that gave me a bunch of autoimmune diseases. That kind of physical trauma gave me lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. It was painful, like I had trouble walking, opening doors, starting my car, things like that. The pain was pretty intense. But kept closing doors, not really hearing my soul trying to get my attention to say, stop doing some of the things you were doing. And I just kept on marching towards I got this goal I got to do. So I buried all the pain, the emotion. I miss George terribly, but I'd never admit it to anyone. I wouldn't even let myself experience the emotion of missing him. And I worked hard to do the right things, quote unquote. I took my medicine, prayed my prayers. I followed the doctor's instructions. I was about 55 pounds heavier than I am right now. My blood pressure, I don't remember what it was, but it was crazy. Like they probably should have hospitalized me for how high my blood pressure was. But and I remember looking in the mirror one day and I looked at it and said, "Who are you?" That's what I said. And nothing answered me back. But I left the boat, ended up teaching at UNC for a little while. So I was teaching in the Naval Science Department, but nothing was working. I was tired, I was emotionless, and I was in a lot of pain. And I was miserable, but I couldn't really see it or even come to terms with it. I told my doctor I wanted to try doing something different because he wanted me to go on some chemotherapy drug for the rest of my life. He said, "I want you to take this chemotherapy drug forever." I was like, that can't be it. That can't be the way. So I did a fast. I fasted for 10 days. I sat in my room upstairs in my house. I was in North Carolina at this point, where my firstborn son happened to be born as well. So he's like the 7th generation to be born in North Carolina, but maybe we'll break that next time around. But yeah, I pleaded. I was angry, I begged, I cried, I yelled, I bargained, and finally I relented. And I remember saying this, I said, "If you don't take this away, these diseases," I said, "at least make me thankful that I have them." And I kind of ended that 10-day fast on that note. And nothing happened, nothing miraculous happened, no bolt of lightning, nothing like that. But a door did open. A few months later, my son Grayson was born, and I was in agony. I was in agony when my son was born. Something wasn't right, and something was happening to me. I had this really strange feeling when I'd get around him. Like I'd want to cuddle him, I'd want to hold him, I'd want to look into his eyes, I'd want to kiss him. I was like, what is all this about? This doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Like this isn't like a useful feeling, like this feeling I have in my body. What is going on? And I thought, oh shit. I was like, I'm in love. Like this is what love is. And I was like, no. Like I cannot love this thing. I was like, I can't do it. I said, because if I do, it's going to get taken away from me. I can't do it. I can't do it. I said, I will not love. I said, it hurt. I wrote down here, it hurts too much when the thing I love is taken away. And I fought it so hard for several weeks. I tried so hard not to give in to love my child. Now, this sounds crazy to some of you guys. And maybe not. Some of you are like, yeah, like I get it, maybe. But we're talking about a baby, not a teenager, okay? So I remember sitting there thinking like it was costing me so much energy to not love Grayson. And I thought, I will die. I cannot do this forever. It takes so much from me to prevent this natural feeling that's trying to happen. And so I remember sitting there in the door. I remember he's sitting there, he's kind of laying on this like a little bassinet or whatever. And I thought, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to love him. Like I can't hold back anymore. So I did. And guys, I tell you what, like it was like something like a well, like a spring burst from my insides and just flowed out. Like this energy flowed for me. And I just surrendered and I cried and I held him and I kissed him. And just kind of going back to that moment. But I gave in and I said, I don't care if it hurts me. I'm going to love this little child. And so I'm wiping the tears away. And I remember I heard a knock at the door. And I said to my wife, I said, "Did you hear that?" She said, "No, what was it?" I was like, "I don't know, maybe nothing." So I heard another knock at the door. And I kept looking I call him G-Man. He's 8 now. But I said, "There's someone at the door." She said, "Do you want me to get it?" And I said, No, I'll get it. So I leapt up because I had this new energy. I just set down the shield that I had been trying to carry around for who knows how long at this point. And so I run downstairs and I opened the door and there was George. George was standing there. You see, George was dead, but George is actually a part of me. George is a part of me. George is my shadow side. I've been killing him. I've been burying him for my entire life, ever since I was a little kid. And so, I had my rational side, my intellectual side, the side that wasn't, supposed to show any emotion. It was supposed to be thinking. That's what was rewarded in my family, not asking questions, falling in line, doing the right thing all the time. So I was burying this other side of me, the creativity, the curiosity. I had to keep that under wraps, at school, in church, at home. But I rediscovered it. And I rediscovered it consciously in that moment. And I invited George back in. And so we walked through a new door together. So the work of integration of the parts that we've ignored, buried, or killed, it's very hard work. I've been on this journey for a while now, and I've been very intentional about it. And that's what I try to do with VEL Institute, is help other people through this. I've been working on it since 2009 and really hard on it for the last 9 years. Our shadow side, or, Carl Jung would talk about our like inferior personality functions, or, something like that. They're here to stay. They're in all of us. All of us have a shadow side. All of us have an inferior function that's trying to bubble up. Your unconscious is trying to send you messages. And for me right now, where I'm at, these parts, they're in union. I have this very, analytical side. I did electrical and nuclear engineering. I did an MBA, and then I did organizational psychology. I've done several, intellectual things. But this emotional side, the side I ignored, it's incredible. Like this experience, I get to feel things and the sensory things that I seek. Now, back in my 20s, I couldn't handle it. It overtook me. I sought sensory experiences with, other women. I sought sensory experiences with alcohol, doing other things, right? So now it's trying to how do I integrate that without letting it overrun my life? So it hurts. And I tell people now, if I describe my experience today, it's like, I say, I feel pregnant with this new version of who I am. And right now I'm in labor and I'm giving birth to some new form of Charles. And I don't really know what that looks like. I'm trying to figure that out as I go. And I'm 38 years old and I definitely don't have it figured out. Not like when I was a kid, I looked at, my father that was 38, like I thought he had everything figured out. But so there's this new, transcendent Charles that is nascent. But I'm no longer controlled by a life that others would see me live. I'm not trying to live up to other people's expectations. And I'm certainly trying more and more not to be controlled by my ego or my subconscious or my shadow side. So they're all these parts of me and all these things are trying to figure out how to dance together. So in closing, I find that your soul gives you some invitations, or your subconscious, or however you want to think about it, however it feels good to frame it for you. But you get these subtle invitations in life where you get invited to go deeper and understand more of who you are. I find that if you ignore those, it just comes back even harder and harder. And eventually it will summon you, your soul, your subconscious, your inferior function, your shadow side, whatever you want to call it. It will summon you and it will get your full attention one day. And either you'll give it attention or you'll die. So anyways, back to my first question, I'll say, now how many of you, you think you're still calling the shots, I guess? When you think about your behavior, I'd be curious if your number went up or down, after kind of listening to this and reflecting. But anyways, I hope that you guys, boldly open doors, walk through them courageously. I hope the first time I've ever told my story in this way. So I hope it, inspires you guys to go a little bit deeper and learn more about yourselves. But thanks.